Hello and welcome back to the Old Soul Millennial channel. In today's video I would like to teach you how I sharpen my chainsaw chains only utilizing some simplistic tools. So what are you going to need? You're going to need an appropriately sized file, which we'll talk about file sizing here in a moment. You're going to need a flat file. It's helpful to have a depth setting gauge, and additionally you're going to need some type of vise. You can use a benchtop vise or a stump mounted vise, up to you, but you need something to hold the bar steady and in place while we sharpen the cutter teeth. In my case, I'm going to be using this bolt-on benchtop vise. Next thing I want to cover is that I'm sure you've seen on Harbor Freight they sell the chainsaw chain grinders. An important note I want to make is if you decide to sharpen your chain with one of those grinders, you cannot switch back and forth between the grinder and a round file. Once you start with one, you need to continue with one. So if you start with the round file, you're going to have to continue sharpening the chain with a round file throughout the lifespan of the chain. Now, let's start talking about files. So, how do you select the proper size file for your chain? Well, you're going to have to figure out what the pitch of your chain is. And the easiest way to do that is to take a look at your chainsaw bar. So looking at the side of my steel NS261, I see that the chain pitch is 0.325. Now, if it was difficult to read on the side of your bar or you're unsure what your pitch is, you can go on your manufacturer's website and take a look at what the common pitch size is for that size chainsaw. Once again, the chain that I'm going to be sharpening on my 261 is 0.325 inch pitch, which that means that we're going to need a 3/16 inch diameter file. If you have a larger pitch chain, such as a 3/8 inch pitch chain, you're going to need a 5 or 7/32 inch diameter file. And if you have a smaller pitch chain, such as a 1/4 inch, you're generally going to need a 5/32 inch file. But again, double check with your manufacturer, double check with the chain manufacturer, and just ensure that you have the proper size file. But those are generally the most common pitch sizes. A really important tip that I want to make is when you're purchasing your files, whether it be round or flat, always try and purchase a higher quality file. Try to stay away from the Chinesium files. Go with a Swiss made or German made or USA made file, and you're going to find that it's going to be so much more of a pleasure to sharpen your chain. Now that we have our appropriately sized file selected for our 0.325 inch pitch chain, what we need to do now is get this chain good and tight on the bar. Could you imagine trying to sharpen this chain right now? These teeth would walk all over the place and you get a really sloppy sharpen. So what we need to do now, take our T-handle tool, we'll crack the bar nuts loose, take the flat screwdriver side of the tool, insert it in the center hole right here, and we'll twist this clockwise until that chain is nice and tight on the bar. Now this chain is extremely tight on the bar. You would never want to set it like this. The only time you'd want to make your chain this tight is when you're sharpening. See, if I take the T-handle tool, I can barely rotate the chain right now, and this is what you want. Now I'm going to install my bolt-on vise. Now we're ready to clamp down our bar in our vise. Now I'm going to clamp this bar down right in the middle, but it's also really important to note that when you clamp this bar down in the vise, ensure that the bottom teeth don't make contact with the bottom of the vise, because we want to be sure that we can spin this chain as we sharpen all these teeth. So before we get to actually filing the chain, I want to talk about chain components, what type of chain this is, and then just some other things to look out for. So, components. These are the drive links in the back, and they engage with the sprocket off the motor. This is your depth gauge. And what the depth gauge does, it is fileable, meaning that you can file this down, but this controls how much wood the cutter teeth removes at any given time. So it is possible to have a very sharp chain, but if you don't file down your depth gauges properly, it's possible that your chain may not remove any wood at all. But you also have to be very careful, because if you file these depth gauges down too low, the cutter teeth are going to take very large chunks of wood, your saw is going to become very jerky, and it becomes very dangerous at that point. So it's important to take these down appropriately, which we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But the type of chain that this is a full chisel chain, because if we look at the cutter tip right here, see this point right here? Notice how this is square? And that means that this is a full chisel chain, and this is commonly what you find on most saws. Full chisel chain is great for removing a lot of wood quickly, cutting through wood quickly. However, the disadvantage is that full chisel chain generally dulls down a little bit quicker. If you were working in very dirty conditions or frozen conditions, conditions in which that your chain is likely to get dull very quickly, then you may want to consider using a semi-chisel chain. Now with the semi-chisel chain, this point is just a little bit rounded. Now also on the cutter tooth, if you take a look, you'll notice that there's a line right here. This is a reference line. We're going to try and match the file to this reference line. So we're going to keep the file parallel to this reference line to ensure that we are sharpening our cutter teeth at the proper angle. So we are just about ready to start filing. What I want you to do is rotate the chain on the bar and look for the most damaged cutter tooth. Once you find the most damaged cutter tooth, well, that's where we're going to start filing at. All right, so I had the camera focused on the dullest cutter tooth on this chain. So what we're going to be doing here is twofold. We're going to be sharpening the top side of the cutter tooth, but we're also going to be sharpening this side gullet because this also helps to pull the chips out of the kerf. But at the same time, we're also trying to create a very sharp point right here. And the point is going to be a good reference as to when the tooth is properly sharpened. So remember earlier we were talking about that reference line. So what you're going to want to do is keep your file parallel to that reference line as we're sharpening the tooth. Additionally, the direction of sharpen is going to be towards the point. So this is the correct direction to be sharpening. Another thing that I want to touch on is how level do you hold the file? Well, a good way to kind of determine that is to rest your file on top of the cutter tooth, and then you could kind of match that pitch. But for most cases, it seems like the file likes to sit just about level in the bar, like the file's level right now, and see how it's making pretty even contact with the top cutter tooth, and that's what you want. Like this is no good, that's too steep. Now this is back pitch, and you can see if we sharpen like this, we're not going to sharpen the point of the cutter tooth, and that's no good. So parallel to that reference line and keep the file about level or even with the top cutter tooth. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to start sharpening this tooth full strokes, and I'm going to count how many strokes it takes to get this tooth sharp. So once I determine how many full strokes it takes to sharpen this tooth, then we're going to go down along the length of the bar, and we're going to use the same number of strokes over every cutter tooth to ensure that the saw cuts evenly and it doesn't veer to one side. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Could use one more. 6. All right, so it took me 6 strokes to sharpen this tooth. Now, how do you know when the tooth is sharp? Well, my method, I know it's not the safest method, but I take a corner of a finger and I dig it into the cutting tip right here. And if I feel it start to dig into my finger, well, I know that that tooth is good and sharp. This tooth is good and sharp, so now I'm going to go down along the length of the bar utilizing 6 strokes, and we're going to sharpen all these teeth. Another important tip that I almost forgot, the tooth that you started on, make sure you mark it. So that way you don't sharpen it again, and you know that when you go a complete revolution around the bar that you are done with one side. So another pro tip I want to give you is having many points of contact. So I have both my feet on the ground, have my hip against the work table, have my hand resting on the saw and wrapped around the saw. And this allows me to really control the file. And this is critical in getting a really good sharpen on your chain, right? Like you have 2 feet on the ground and you're just holding the bar and trying to work the file with one hand, forget about it. It's going to come out like a mess. So having many points of contact really helps to guide that file. One, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So obviously there's cutter teeth that cut towards the left side of the chain, and then there's cutter teeth that cut towards the right side of the chain. So I just finished the left cutting cutter teeth, and now we need to move on to the more challenging side, which for me, being right-handed, is the pull cord side of the saw. I say it's more challenging because I no longer have the saw to rest my left elbow on. So my technique, I like to spread out my legs and then take my hip and rest it against the work table. So now I'm nice and solid, I have good footing, and I'm very stable. And from there, same thing, we're just going to grab the file and then start filing these teeth. I tell you, stability, it's definitely a little bit more challenging on this side, but this is a whole lot better than trying to sharpen your chainsaw on the back of a pickup truck with one hand. Here's the cutter tooth that we marked earlier on as our start point, so we're just going to roll the chain forward a little bit. We're going to start with the one behind it now. Same thing, 6 strokes. Now that we have these cutter teeth razor sharp, we need to make the determination as to whether we need to file down these depth gauges or not. And the depth gauges, as mentioned earlier, they sit right in front of the cutter teeth and they control how much wood those cutter teeth bite into at any given point in time. Now, if you file down these depth gauges too much, your saw is going to become very jerky. Kickback is much more likely. It's very dangerous. It's harder on the motor, harder on the sprocket, and it's just something you want to try and avoid. However, the opposite of that is if these depth gauges are too high, you could have a razor sharp chain, but you'll find that it'll only spit out sawdust or it won't really bite into the wood. So it's critical that these depth gauges are filed properly. And that can be achieved with a depth gauge filing tool. This one's made by steel, so what you do, lay it over the cutter teeth, and you can see there's a little drop down section. So what you would do, drop this right over one of your depth gauges, take a flat file, and then just run this file over the depth gauge filing tool. And going over these depth gauges right now, I feel that the file is not making contact with any of these depth gauges, so that tells me that all these depth gauges are set just fine. So once you finish filing your chain, don't forget to loosen up that chain tension. So I like to set my chain tension to where those drive links just start to come up out of the channel. Now you're going to want to lift up on the bar. Notice how there's a little bit of rock, so we're going to lift up on the bar, check our chain tension one more time. It's still good. And now you can lock down your bar nuts. And that concludes today's video on how to properly sharpen a chainsaw chain. Now I will leave a link in the description down below for this depth gauge setting tool, as well as my bolt-on benchtop vise and a stump mounted vise, which is great if you're out in the field and you need to sharpen your chain. But now that this chain is good and sharp, you want to protect your nice sharp chain. Always use a bar cover. And if you do need to set your saw down for a moment, you know, you're out in the woods cutting, try and lay the bar down on a piece of wood or a stick, just something soft that's not going to damage these teeth, because we want to keep these teeth sharp for as long as possible. With that, I would like to know, is there anything you would have done different in this video? Let me know down in the comments section down below. And as always, I will catch you on the next one.